Hello? It's AP season. It remains to be seen if we can do one video an entire year to pass the AP test. So here's what I propose. One video, everything you need to know to pass the AP test in one session. I've been working out, been drinking a lot of Red Bull. I'm ready to do it. So, we're not aiming for the 5 or the 4, but for 3. Can we get a 3 out of this video? Let's see, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll begin in the Enlightenment, and that is with John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to be talking pretty fast if I'm going to be able to get through this in a decent amount of time. John Locke, Thomas Jefferson both believed, if you look at the Second Treatise of Civil Government, you look at the Declaration of Independence, the purpose of government is to protect natural or inalienable rights. The purpose of government is limited. It's not to deal with income inequality or give you services or give you stuff or to help you. It's to protect your rights, to maximize your freedom. That's it. Okay, so that's the purpose of limited government. Now, the very first time the new Americans tried to create a government, it was called the Articles of Confederation in 1781, and it didn't go well. And it didn't go well because they didn't trust centralized authority. They didn't like the monarchical power of George III, so they created a very, very weak government where all the power was not in the center of the society, in the capital. It was distributed. It was fragmented among the states. And that's why it's called the Articles of Confederation. It was a confederacy. And the Articles of Confederation didn't work for a lot of reasons. It lacked powers. It couldn't have the states honor their militia commitments. They couldn't raise taxes. They couldn't regulate commerce. They had no Supreme Court. They had no executive. And the legislature was a mess. You had to have 9 out of 13 to pass a law. You had to have 13 out of 13 to actually amend the Articles of Confederation, so it was a mess. And so that's where we get the Constitutional Convention. And at the Constitutional Convention, you have James Madison who shows up with a plan. It's called the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan is essentially a bicameral legislature. You have a House, you're going to have a Senate, an upper and a lower house, but they're both based on population, right? So the bigger states like Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania are going to have more delegates than people who are from places like Delaware or South Carolina. So, of course, the small states don't like that. And William Patterson of New Jersey comes up with his own plan called the New Jersey Plan, and it's a unicameral plan. So it has one chamber, one vote for each state, just like the Articles of Confederation. And so what do you get? You get the Great Compromise. You get the Connecticut Plan. It says, okay, well, we'll have bicameralism, but we will have one chamber based on population. That's the House of Representatives, and the other one based on the principle of equality. That will be the Senate. Okay, and so that's the Connecticut Plan, the Great Compromise. One other thing about the Constitutional Convention: once you have one chamber based on population, the House, you have to deal with slavery. That would be the 3/5 compromise, where each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person. Now, as soon as the convention is over, that's when the work begins. It has to be ratified by 9 out of the 13 states. Now, ultimately, 11 out of 13 ratify it by the time Washington is sworn into office in 1791. North Carolina and Delaware do eventually, or Rhode Island, excuse me, do eventually ratify it. But at the beginning of the country, we only had 11 out of 13 on board. But you have 2 camps during this constitutional debate in all the different states, all the ratification debates. You have the Federalists, who favor ratification, led by Hamilton and Madison and John Jay and others. And then you have the Anti-Federalists, or the Anti-Federalists, people who were opposed ratification. And you can list, there were dozens of problems the Anti-Federalists had. Okay, they didn't like the Electoral College. They didn't like the President as Commander-in-Chief. They didn't like Article 1, Section 8. They didn't like all the broad clauses. The list can go ad infinitum. It can go on and on and on. Ultimately, what they didn't like was that power had shifted from being completely in state control to more of a federal system, where states still have a lot of power, but the federal government also has a lot of power now. You have the Supremacy Clause in Article 5 of the Constitution. They didn't like that. They did not like strong centralized authority. The Anti-Federalists were not idiots. They saw in the Constitution, they saw the seeds of empire. If you read the Anti-Federalist papers, the pseudonym is Brutus. Now, what did Brutus do? Brutus killed Caesar because he was going to dissolve the Senate and create an empire, create his own kind of quasi-monarchy. A dictatorship, if you will. And that's exactly what they feared about the federal constitution, is that America was sowing the seeds of empire. What does empire mean? High taxes. It means bureaucracy. It means standing armies. All the things that we have today, by the way. So the Anti-Federalists were not idiots, and their big success was that in the Virginia ratification debate, they got Madison to acquiesce to the idea of adding a Bill of Rights. Madison didn't think a Bill of Rights was necessary. He said, look, the Constitution is there to enumerate what the powers of the government are. It's not there to list rights of individuals, but ultimately he decides to do so, and he does it during the very first Congress in 1791, 1792. Okay, so that's the beginning of the country when it comes to the the Constitution. Now, don't forget, there are two important Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper 10 and 51. Federalist Paper 51 is about checks and balances, about the separation of powers, how you need auxiliary precautions is how he describes it. Federalist Paper number 10 is a little more complicated. It's about what we call Madisonian pluralism and the idea that in a free society, individuals are going to band together to form groups. You remember that F word, factions, where they're pursuing their self-interest. And of course, what Madison did was he disagreed with Montesquieu and kind of the classical philosophers who said republics only work in small societies. He said, actually, let's have an extended republic. In a large society, you have lots of factions, you take in a huge variety of interests, and therefore you make it unlikely that one faction will be able to oppress the rest. So essentially our pluralism, our diversity is keeping us free. So that's, and by the way, in that kind of a society where you have so many divergent interests, how do you ever get anything done? Well, the answer is a republican form of government, have a representative democracy. So Madison said, look, we expect everyday people, citizens like you and me, we're going to pursue our self-interest. But we're going to elect our leaders, who are kind of classical Republicans, like in the Roman sense, who are there to look out for the res publica, the common good of the country. They're not there to pursue their interests. They're there to write laws that look out for the common good of the nation, right? So a Republican form of government solves the excesses of Madisonian factions, okay? So those are the two Federalist Papers you need to know. Now, amending the Constitution, Article 5 of the Constitution, there are 4 ways of amending the Constitution. 26 out of 27 amendments have been amended the same way, and that way would be where you get 2/3 of the House and the Senate have to agree, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures, okay? And now, because it's so difficult to amend the Constitution, you have informal amendments. And informal amendments are where we change the way the government operates, but we're not actually amending the Constitution. So, you know, court decisions, custom like, you know, things like before the 22nd Amendment, presidents not serving more than 2 terms, every law of Congress, by the way, executive actions, political parties. All of these things are informal amendments. They're part of the way that we do the business of government without actually being in the Constitution itself. Okay? So now let's talk about federalism. And federalism is never mentioned in the Constitution, but essentially federalism is a blending of a confederacy and a unitary system, so that the national and the state systems share power. And as Madison says in Federalist Paper 45, the federalists, you know, in the federal government and in the national government, the powers of the federal government are few and defined. The powers of the states are plentiful. And so when we talk about, you know, traditional powers for the states, what you get in the very beginning is this idea of dual federalism or layer cake federalism, where the state and the federal governments do different things, right? So in the state, what kind of powers do states usually have traditionally? Education, they run their own prisons, law enforcement, infrastructure, marriage, elections. These are all the things that states typically do for themselves. What does the national government do? Everything else. They raise an army, they raise a navy, they obviously can deal with things like treaties and immigration. All those things listed in Article 1, Section 8 are enumerated powers for the federal government. Okay, now, sometimes you have what we call sharing of powers or concurrent powers, where the state and the federal government can do that. Those things, taxes would be a concurrent power. Having a judicial system is a concurrent power. Trust me, it's April 17th. I know that the state and the federal government tax me because I just sent off big checks 2 days ago. That's a big concurrent power. So make sure you know, the enumerated powers of the national government. The reserved powers are the ones for the states, and the concurrent are the ones that are done for both of them. And throughout most of American history, what you had was a clear delineation between the two. And in the early days of the Republic, there was one big constitutional question. And the question is, when the state and the national governments conflict, who wins out? And that's where we get to the most important decision in all of AP government. It's always on the test, and that's McCulloch versus Maryland. And in McCulloch versus Maryland, the state of Maryland was trying to tax a federal entity, which was the Second National Bank. John Marshall said that, look, this is a constitution we are expounding. He talked about the idea of implied powers. He used the supremacy clause to say when, in fact, the national and state governments disagree, the state governments are going to be on the losing end. The national governments will be supreme. He also argued that in Gibbons versus Ogden, which dealt with ferrying rights. So make sure you know, in federalism, for most of American history, they were very separate. But when they did conflict, McCulloch versus Maryland, and dealing with that issue, the Second National Bank definitely sided with the national government. Now, here's what happens. You get to FDR, you get to LBJ, you even get to Barack Obama, and what you see is this huge mixing up. So what you used to have was layer cake federalism, right? Layer cake federalism, where the state and the national government are separate. Well, what you get with the New Deal And then when you get with the Great Society, you get marble cake, right? And that's where they're all mixed up, right? You're doing the marble cake dance right now. All the powers are getting mixed up, right? And so that's where we go from traditional dual federalism so that now we have cooperative federalism. From the 1930s and 1960s, you have all this cooperation where the national government is now doing things that the state governments used to do. Now, Nixon and Reagan tried to give power back to the states a little bit. That's called devolution, to devolve power back to the states. That's called competitive federalism, but it wasn't particularly successful. Now, question. What are the different parts of the Constitution that deal with federalism without using the federalism word? Well, the most important one is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says all powers not given to the national government fall to the states and to the people. The 9th Amendment says that there are unenumerated rights in the Constitution. Even if it's not listed here in the Bill of Rights, that doesn't mean you don't have them. Article 4 of the Constitution is what we call the full faith and credit clause, and says that all legal agreements in one state have to be fully followed in all the other states, okay? And also don't forget about the Supremacy Clause, which says that if the state and the national governments conflict, the national government is supreme. There's a long story about that. That's the only victory that Madison got when it came to giving the national government supreme power. He wanted the national government, in fact, to be able to veto state powers. But I digress, and I'm determined not to do that today. Also, don't forget this term called fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism is this idea nowadays where the federal government gives a lot of the money that it gives out, it gives to the states. A lot of the states get their funding from the national government now that the national and state governments are so intertwined, right? A good example would be education. Education used to be strictly a state power. Now with No Child Left Behind, Common Core, Race to the Top, you see the federal government giving grants to the states. So let's talk about the different kinds of grants and mandates. How does the federal government get its paws into the state's business, right? Well, the way they do that is through grants and mandates. And you have funded mandates and unfunded mandates. A funded mandate is when the federal government says, hey state, you have to do this, and we will give you money to do it, right? And there are highway mandates, and there are all kinds of different examples of where the federal government will give money to make sure that they carry out a national law. On the other hand, you have unfunded mandates, like the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, where it says, hey, state businesses, you have to pay for all these changes, and we're not going to give you a cent to do it. It's an unfunded mandate. A mandate is just an order that the government is giving to the different states. Now, what about grants? Well, you have what we would call a categorical grant, which is the most common kind. Over 90% of all grants are categorical, and that means that the grant is given for a specific category. A lot of Medicare is given as a form of categorical funding. So this national government just doesn't just give a big pot of money to California and say, hey, do what you want to. They put it in different categories that, hey, you have to spend this money on this program, and you have to do it in this way, and you have to implement it according to this bureaucratic guide of A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever. That's a categorical grant. Now, a block grant, which is what Republicans tend to like, is when the federal government says, you know what, you know your problems better than we do. We're not going to dictate from top to bottom. Here's a pot of money. You are states, you legislatures, you are closer to the problems. You decide how the money is going to be spent. Now, that doesn't happen very much anymore. Block grants are becoming increasingly passé. But again, categorical grants are the most common form of funding when you're talking about federalism nowadays. Okay, so make sure you guys know that. And then finally, make sure when you look at the different ways that the governments have grown, all the growth of government has taken place at the state level. If you look at the number of workers in the federal government, it's pretty even. It's pretty consistent there. If you look at the number of state workers in the last 50 years, it's gone up like this. And why is that? Well, that's because you might have a lot more federal laws, but that's because many of those federal laws and federal programs are carried out at the state level. And that is on the AP test a lot. That question of, well, if the federal government's gotten stronger and bigger and more expensive, why hasn't it hired more workers? Very simple, because they hand it off to the states to do it. That's cooperative federalism. That's fiscal federalism nowadays. Okay? Now, I'm going to get a drink. Give me a second. Now, let's move on to Congress. When we talk about Congress, we have to talk about Article 1, Section 8. These are the enumerated powers of Congress. You can look those up on your own, but make sure you understand the ability to tax, the ability to raise an army, the ability to raise war, the ability to create new cabinets and new departments, the ability to create courts, the ability to decide weights and measurements, the ability to regulate the economy, the ability to create new programs. I don't know if I said that already. The list goes on and on. Make sure you review Article 1, Section 8. the enumerated powers. Now, Article 1, Section 9 are the denied powers. These are things that Congress cannot do. You cannot pass a bill of attainder. You cannot pass ex post facto laws. You cannot create, on Article 1, Section 10, you cannot create titles of nobility. So Article 1, Section 10 is what the states cannot do. So they cannot grant titles of nobility and other things of that nature. So Article 1, Section 8, enumerated powers of Congress. Article 1, Section 9, denied powers, ex post facto, bills of attainder. Article 1, Section 10 are the denied powers to the states. Make sure you know that. Now, let's talk about the House and the Senate. The House has 435 people. The Senate has 100. And there are a lot, what do they love to ask about in the AP test is all the differences. Lots of differences. They love to ask that question. Now, let's talk about the House. The House, 435 people. They are elected for a 2-year term. You only have to be 25 years old. You only represent a congressional district. Okay? Now, in the Senate, you have 100 people. Your term is 6 years. You were originally elected by state legislatures, but that changed with the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct election of senators. And they have different powers, and there are big differences between the two. So let's start with the House. Okay, in the House, they are very rule-bound. You have 435 people. You have lots of rules. The leadership exerts a tremendous amount of power. The majority party can pretty much do whatever it wants to do. All revenue bills must begin in the House of Representatives. And they are very reliant on the committees in the House of Representatives as well. They tend to be much more partisan. They tend to be much more rowdy, not as much bipartisanship, not as much statesmanship going on. So in the Senate, and by the way, also the House of Representatives, if there's no electoral college majority, they get to elect the President of the United States in a weird way. They don't vote 435 individual members. They vote as individual state blocks. So California would get 1 vote. Alaska would get 1 vote. Very weird, okay? So that's the House. In the Senate, they're very different. They're a very collegial body. They operate very, very slowly. Each individual senator has powers, the filibuster, the ability to place holds on bills, the ability to essentially, thwart the will of the majority in the Senate. In the Senate, they ratify treaties with a 2/3 vote. They actually have more powers to deal with confirmation of presidential appointments like ambassadors and secretaries of judges. That all goes through the Senate as well, and they get to elect the vice president if the Electoral College does not select a vice president, all right? So make sure you know the differences between the two. Lots and lots and lots of differences between the two there. Now, what about the impeachment process? Now, impeachment is a process. Impeachment just means to bring up on charges, and any federal official can be impeached. All you need is a majority vote in the House of Representatives. If you are impeached, that means you go to the Senate where you have a trial, and the trial can remove you with a 2/3 vote. Remember, 2 presidents have been impeached. We all know Andrew Johnson came within 1 vote. Edmund Ross, I believe of Kansas, saved him. And of course, William Jefferson Clinton didn't even get close to removal, but he was in fact impeached, okay? And that applies to all federal officials, not just presidents, but also vice presidents and secretaries and judges as well, okay? So that's the impeachment process. Now, the other thing that Congress can do besides writing law is oversight, and oversight is all over the AP test. Because Congress has the power of the purse, because all revenue bills, I forgot to mention this, all revenue bills must begin in the House of Representatives. Because of that, they are responsible for making sure that all the different executive agencies of government operate the way that they're supposed to. So what is oversight? Well, oversight is when usually it's conducted by committees in the House and the Senate. That's where they bring in personnel and they make sure that, that everything is being spent correctly. They have hearings, they launch investigations. Congress has the power to bring people in, to testify. They have that kind of power to make people come in. Now, of course, they can be like Lois Lerner of the IRS and plead the Fifth. But Congress does have the power to make people come in and testify as a consequence of their oversight power. So oversight is a tremendously important thing. Make sure you know how they do it. They can tinker with agencies' budgets. Congress can say no to presidential appointments. They can reorganize agencies like we did with Homeland Security. So Congress has immense oversight power. Make sure you know it. Now, there are quite a few key terms here that you should know. The necessary and proper clause, also called the elastic clause. This is very important in allowing the federal government to become what it has become today, which is a no longer really a limited government. We're more of an activist government. Most of the time we don't even ask the question if Congress can do something because of the necessary and proper clause. Also, the Commerce Clause, probably the most controversial in the last 5 years because of the Affordable Care Act. The Commerce Clause is important because that is the main mechanism by which the federal government can regulate the economy. Okay, so all these things about minimum wage laws, all of these things about the Obamacare mandates, all that is justified through the Commerce Clause. Make sure you know that. Okay, now pork barrel is essentially earmarks. It's when congressmen bring home projects to their home district to pump up their chances of re-election. The Franklin privilege is free mail for House and Senate members. Log rolling, that's when a congressman will try and trade votes. They'll try and get one congressman to vote for their bill and return their vote for that congressman's bill. They're trading votes. They're log rolling. Okay, specialization, I should have mentioned this a minute ago. In the House of Representatives, you have congressmen who are specialized in their district. If you are a congressman in Oklahoma, you probably don't need to know about oceanic affairs, but if you are a congressperson in Oregon on the coast, you probably do. You probably need to know about lumber, but probably not about oil. So House members tend to specialize. Senators tend to have to kind of be a jack of all trades. They need to know a little bit of everything. Okay, 17th Amendment, which I already mentioned, was the direct election of senators. The filibuster, very important. In the Senate, they have this tradition of open and unending debate. It's called the filibuster. It's when one Senate can get up there and talk a bill to death. You can end a filibuster with a cloture vote, and that means with 60 senators voting for cloture, you can end a filibuster and force a vote on a bill. So again, a filibuster is not really a rule. It's an absence of a rule forcing a vote on a bill. We just changed that, by the way, in the Senate in one regard. Nowadays, if you're talking about appointments, then you only need 51. That was just changed this year. So make sure you guys know it. A safe seat is when a House member doesn't really worry about getting reelected. Most House seats actually are safe seats. If you can get 55% of the vote, you are a safe seat. Presidential coattails. That means if the president's getting elected and you're from their party and they are popular, it tends to help you in a congressional election. That means riding presidential coattails. President Obama had huge coattails in 2008. It helped the Democrats running in the Senate and the House win their elections because Obama was so popular in that year. Same with Reagan in 1980, perhaps. So make sure you know those terms. Now, let's talk about a big issue in the House of Representatives, and that is gerrymandering. And in the House of Representatives, every 10 years they have to take a census and figure out how many people are in the country and how many people are in each state. That is called reapportionment, when you kind of figure out how many districts each state gets. That happens after the census. We're going to reapportion. So for instance, 2 years ago, Texas gained 4. And then you have other states that lost them, right? And so that's reapportionment. Once you figure out how many districts each state gets, then you redraw it, and that is called redistricting. Okay, so make sure you know the difference between the two. And redistricting happens when you redraw those boundaries, and that's where gerrymandering happens. And gerrymandering is when the party in that state that has all the power draws the lines to benefit their party. It's manipulating those boundaries to gain in a partisan fashion. That's gerrymandering. Now, there are limits to gerrymandering, but it still happens. What are those limits? Well, 2 to be specific. 1 is you cannot have what we call malapportionment. Westbury versus Sanders, Baker versus Carr, essentially one man, one vote. You have to have equal numbers in different congressional districts, right? You have places in Michigan and in Georgia in the 1960s that were having huge disparities within the same state. You know, 500,000 in this district and then 50,000 in this one. That's malapportionment. You can't do that. The other thing you can't do is what we call minority-majority districts. Now, the Supreme Court, frankly, has been all over the place with this. It is okay to try and encourage minority representation, but the Supreme Court has essentially said you can't have that as the number one and only reason for drawing a district. Again, the Supreme Court's a little vague on the minority-majority districting, but it has been limited to a certain extent, so make sure you know that, okay? Now, why do House members have a higher re-election rate than the Senate? In the House, they have a re-election rate around 90%. In the Senate, it's around 70%, for good reason. And that's because the House is more frequently re-elected, and you don't have so many people you're responsible for. In the House, you know, if you're liked by 700,000 people and you do what they want you to do, and you have big name recognition, you have a fundraising advantage, like 19-to-1 is the average, you have a record of service, like bringing home the bacon, you know, people have met you, you're going to get reelected in the House. Again, that's why they have this overwhelming, being an incumbent is great living, right? You have a huge record to run on. In the Senate, you know, sometimes you do things that make your constituents angry. You're only elected every 6 years. You represent an entire state. It's a little more diverse. It's hard to specialize the way that a congressman in the House can. So make sure you understand that the House has a higher reelection rate than the Senate for that reason, kind of that shorter term. They represent fewer people. They can specialize, okay? Now, let's talk about leadership in the Congress. The House is much more reliant on leadership than the Senate is. In the Senate, everybody thinks that they're a king. In the House, you're one of 435. Obviously, the very first leadership position mentioned in the Constitution is is the Speaker of the House, elected by the overall House of Representatives. Technically, you don't even have to be a member of the House, though everyone has. The very first Speaker of the House was Frederick Muhlenberg from Pennsylvania. But the Speaker of the House is in charge of the entire House. And traditionally, it wasn't supposed to be a partisan role. Of course, Cannon and Reed changed that in the early 1900s. But technically, that's why the Speaker rarely gives speeches. He doesn't serve on any committees, is because he's supposed to be in charge of the entire House. Now, you go beyond that, it gets very partisan very quickly. You have the majority leader and the minority leader. They are elected by their caucuses or their conferences. The Democrats have a caucus. That's all the Democrats come together and elect their leaders. The Republicans have a conference. They come together, they elect their leaders. So you have the majority leader, the minority leader. What are they responsible for? Eric Cantor and Nancy Pelosi. They're there to create an agenda for their party. They are designed to be partisan, to make sure that their party has an agenda and a playbook that everybody in their party is following. Under that, they have their lieutenants, which are the whips, and the whips are there to whip them into shape, make sure that the voting blocks vote together. Of course, House Majority Leader, House Majority Whip Kevin McCarthy has a tough job. I think he has the toughest job in Washington because he has to deal with kind of the mainstream, kind of run-of-the-mill Republican, and then you have the Tea Party as well, and he has to try and make sure they all vote together. That's what the whip is there to do. It's tough job to whip those votes together. So make sure you know the Speaker of the House, make sure you know the majority and minority leader, make sure you know the majority and minority whips and what their jobs are. Over in the Senate, really, the president of the Senate is the vice president. He has no power. He just breaks ties. The president pro tempore, who is the longest serving member from the majority party, they don't have any power either unless the president, the vice president, and the speaker die. Then they get to be president. Really, all the power is the majority leader. Good old, Harry Reid has all the power, and that's because he gets to set the agenda. He's like a one-man rules committee over there in the Senate. And so, now he can be thwarted very easily because of the filibuster, but still, that's where all the power in the Senate is with the majority leader. So make sure you know that. Now, let's talk about the committees. In the House of Representatives, 3 committees you need to know. Ways and Means, and they deal with taxes, and of course all revenue bills must begin in the House. That's Ways and Means. Appropriations, that's how you spend the money. And the most powerful one, which is always dominated by the majority party, is the Rules Committee. They are the ones who set the agenda for the House of Representatives, and they say, hey, here's what we're going to vote on. So again, you could get out of a standing committee and get to the Rules Committee, and they might not even schedule a vote for you. So make sure you know those 3 committees in the House. In the Senate, make sure you know the Judiciary Committee, because they're the ones who have judicial nominees, and they have those hearings. Make sure you know about Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committee, because in the Senate is much more involved in foreign affairs than the House is. The House is really a domestic institution. They really don't deal with foreign affairs, whereas the Senate, they have to deal with treaties, they have to confirm people. So in foreign policy, the Senate, if you go back early days of the Republic, people were afraid that the Senate was going to be just as powerful as the president in foreign affairs. Early on, in fact, Hamilton and Madison had a disagreement in the 1790s about who should be conducting foreign policy. It's what we call the Pacificus and Helvidius debates. Madison said the Senate should be co-equal with the president. Now, of course, it's the one debate Madison ever lost, and of course he lost it to Colonel Hamilton. But still, that shows you how powerful the Senate should be in foreign affairs. Okay, now, let's talk about these committees and what they do. Obviously, as I said already, they conduct oversight, but they also, that's where almost all the laws die. That's where they study legislation. That's where they wheel and deal. That's where they have markup, which is where you write the bill itself and you get everybody's input. So the committee is where you have people testify, you study the law, you vote on the law. That's where a lot of the lobbying takes place. And again, most bills die in committee. Only 16% of bills ever get out of committee. And let's talk about the chairman. What is the number one power of the chairman? The chairman gets to decide which bills to consider. And that's why chairmen are so important. Now, chairmen always come from the majority party in the House and in the Senate. So every single chairman in the House of Representatives today, it's 2014, I don't know how long this video is going to be around, every single chairman is a Republican. In the Senate, every single chairman is a Democrat, right? Because that's what the majority party is in those different chambers. And they get to decide which bills to consider. Who gets to be chairman? Usually the seniority principle. Usually the person who has served the longest on that committee. Now, if you make the speaker mad or the majority leader mad, that can change. It's not an ironclad rule, but that's typically the way that it works. So make sure you know the powers of committees. A few random things, make sure you guys know about this. Make sure you know about the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. They're the ones who look at the bills in a nonpartisan manner and figure out how much they're going to cost and how it's going to impact the budget. The GAO, they're the ones, the General Accounting Office, they're the ones who essentially audit all the different executive agencies and make sure they're spending the money the way that they're supposed to. Also, make sure you know about the way that a bill becomes a law. When it goes through the House, of course, there's a lot more steps. In the Senate, there are fewer steps. But remember this: when the House and the Senate pass different versions of a bill, they have to go to conference committee, right? And the conference committee is where you have members of the House and the Senate. They come together, they reconcile those bills, and then it goes back to the House and the Senate, and they vote on the reconciled bill before it goes to the president, who can veto it. And if he vetoes it, by the way, it can come back and be overridden with a 2/3 vote in the House and in the Senate, right? So make sure you know that. There are quite a few ways that the president can check Congress. The president can check Congress by vetoing laws, by issuing executive orders, the OMB is the one that suggests a budget. So the president has a lot of power over Congress, even if he doesn't feel like it sometimes. Okay, with that in mind, let's talk about the President of the United States. Another drink. Presidency, very, very important. Article 2 of the Constitution talks about the American presidency, and there are quite a few powers that the president has by himself, right? The president by himself can veto a law. The president himself is commander-in-chief. The president by himself can issue executive orders. The president by himself can make nominations. The president by himself it's kind of an informal power, but he can lead the country. He's a leader of the free world. The president by himself can do all sorts of things. So make sure you know all the powers that the president has by himself. Now, when you talk about foreign policy, obviously he's commander-in-chief. He also is the chief diplomat. He negotiates treaties, and he can also have what we call executive agreements. Now, these are different than treaties. Executive agreements are just bilateral. It's when the president has an agreement with another nation. It's kind of what we had with the Lend-Lease Act of 1940, and it used to be that Congress didn't even need to know about it. Nowadays, starting in the 1970s, for obvious reasons, Congress has to know about it, but bilateral agreement would be an executive agreement. So, president has a lot of foreign policy powers. Now, when we talk about unofficial powers are powers that the president has, but it's not really listed in the Constitution. I think the number one is the rhetorical presidency, is the ability to directly communicate with the American people, to give his agenda, to try and convince them that he's right in order to put pressure on Congress to give it his way. So that's an unofficial power. The president is the leader of his party. That's very unofficial. Parties aren't in the Constitution. He's definitely the leader of his party. He's leader of the free world. No question about that as well. And so these are all unofficial. Probably the most important unofficial power would be executive privilege, this idea that the president has a zone of privacy among his peers and among his staff and his confidants and his intimates, that they cannot be part of an investigation, now U.S. versus Nixon, so that there is, in fact, an executive privilege. Now, it only applies to national security, but executive privilege is an unofficial power. Make sure you know that one. Now, how do you get to be president of the United States? Well, you have to be 35 years old. You have to be a natural-born citizen. I mean, you have to be a president. You have to be an American from the time you were born. You have to get a majority of the Electoral College, and you have to have lived in the United States for 14 years. These are the qualifications. Now, it used to be that the best stepping stone to the presidency was the Secretary of State. Nowadays, it tends to be being a governor, President Bush, President Clinton, President Reagan, President Carter. These were all governors of either big or southern states. Senators, Barack Obama's kind of the anomaly there. There have only been 4 members from the Congress who then step over into the presidency. So, you tend to have executives before they're president, right? People who are generals, people who are governors, people who are vice presidents. These are the best stepping stones to the presidency nowadays. Now, let's talk about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is complicated. And what happened is that in 1787, the Founding Fathers didn't trust the people to vote directly. Again, they didn't see direct democracy as a good thing. So what they decided was that each state would send a certain amount of electors. Now, what decides how many electors a state gets? It's the number of House members plus the number of senators. So the minimum number you could have is 3. In California here, we have 55 because we have 53 congressional districts, 2 senators. And the way that you become president is you win a majority of the electoral votes. So there are 538. You get to 270. And so really what happens on the first Tuesday of November is not a presidential election. it's 51 different state elections. And on that date, what you do is you're just voting to decide which party of electors you're going to send to be counted on January 6th. The real presidential election is January 6th. That's when the vice president, who only has 2 official capacities in the Constitution, by the way, in the Constitution, either he breaks ties and he also counts the electoral vote. On January 6th, the vice president pops open all the votes that he's gotten from the 51 states. I'm counting DC as a state. Whoever gets to 270 gets to be president. So that's the Electoral College. Lots of problems with it. A lot of people don't like it. Some people want to have just a popular vote, just abolish the Electoral College and have a straight popular vote. Some people want to do what they do in Maine and Nebraska, which is where for every congressional district you win, you get 1 electoral vote. And if you win the state, you get the 2 Senate votes. Some people want to do a hybrid of those two. Some people want to just have a proportionality where if you get 60% of the popular vote, you get 60% of the electoral vote. Colorado almost did that in 2004. You have something called the National Bonus Plan. You have all kinds of different ideas for abolishing or reforming the Electoral College. Now, if nobody gets to a majority or there's a tie, it's decided by the House, and the Senate decides the vice president. That's what happened in 1800. That's how we got the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment said that, look, every elector still gets 2 votes. It used to be that whoever got first place was president, whoever got second place was vice president. The way it is now, that is electors both get, they not get 2 votes, but they get 1 vote for president, 1 vote for vice president. And that's how we make sure you don't get an 1800 scenario where Burr and Jefferson tied with 73 votes and it went to the House and it took 36 rounds of voting, and that's what created the 12th Amendment. So make sure you know that. Now, let's talk about the different acts of the 1970s to check Nixon. The most important one is the War Powers Act, and the War Powers Act of 1973 said a lot of things, but mainly 2 things. That the president has 48 hours to notify Congress if he deploys troops, and he has 60 days to get permission. That could be a resolution, that could be a declaration, who knows. 60 to 90 days to get permission. Lots of problems with that law. We don't have time to get into it now, but make sure you know it. The Impoundment Act of 1974 that said that when the Congress allocates funds, because they have the power of the purse, the president can't impound that money and put it where he wants it. It has to go where Congress goes. And then finally, don't forget the Freedom of Information Act, which said that members of the executive branch essentially have to turn over documentation to watchdog groups and to the public if they request it. So make sure you know those 3 laws, okay? Now, what about the cabinet? Well, the cabinet is the different departments of the executive branch, and they enforce the law and they implement programs. So for instance, you have a Secretary of State, you have a Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Education. All of these are positions that they are in charge of implementing different areas of the law. So if you're Secretary of State, you are in charge of your country's foreign policy. If you're in charge of Health and Human Services, you have to implement the Affordable Care Act. If you're in charge of the Department of Education, you had to do No Child Left Behind in the last decade. And so that's what the different departments of the executive branch, which are headed by a secretary, are there to do. And it can be tough to be a secretary because you have, your department that you're in charge of and your people, but you also have the president who you serve in at the pleasure of, and you can be fired by the president. And so it's very tough to be a secretary in the executive branch where the president is in charge of all these things, okay? So make sure you know that. Now, what about presidential popularity? Well, we now have this thing called approval ratings. And you want to have an approval rating in the 50s. Anything in the 60s would be great. What kind of thing raises an approval rating? Well, number 1 would be a crisis, right? And this is where you have some kind of foreign policy crisis, something like 9/11. George Bush's approval rating went up, and then it went down for the next 7 years. A crisis, you rally around the flag, that brings up approval ratings. A good economy, like Bill Clinton was saved probably by a great economy. You have a legislative victory of some kind. Something good has happened, like for instance, when we killed Osama bin Laden, President Obama's approval rating went up. Okay, you're at the beginning of your term, the honeymoon period. Anybody who's married knows the honeymoon period, the happy beginning, the first 100 days. That's going to that's going to give you a really high approval rating. Now, what makes it go down? Well, what's going to make it go down is fatigue. People get tired of you at the end. The economy is bad. Look at the first President Bush. When you have a long war, the thing that kills an approval rating the most is when you have a long war. Look what happened to LBJ in Vietnam. Look what happened to George W. Bush in Iraq. A long, drawn-out war kills an approval rating more than anything else does. No question about it. Now, what is an executive order? Well, this has been in the news a lot. This is where the president issues an order to a part of the bureaucracy telling them how to carry out a law of Congress. Now, The president just can't create programs or create new taxes, but he can decide how the law is carried out. Don't forget, he's the chief enforcement officer of the federal government. He's there to enforce the law. And an executive order is where you tell a department of the government how to enforce a law. So the Emancipation Proclamation, famous executive order, when President Obama says, look, here's the Affordable Care Act, here are these dates that are in the law, but we're going to change that a little bit. He does that through an executive order. He says, you know, there's part of the immigration policy I don't like. Congress isn't going to change it, but we just aren't going to enforce part of this immigration law. That's an executive order, right? That's a very powerful tool, very controversial. You can argue about it if you want to, but it's there. Make sure you guys know that. Now, a few terms here. Lame duck president. Lame duck president is the president in the last 2 years of his term. This is somebody who Congress isn't going to listen to anymore. Make sure you know that term. Let's talk about the vice president for a minute. Lately, the vice president, because of the 25th Amendment, the vice presidency is more important. It used to be kind of a joke. Nowadays, the vice president is there for two reasons. One, to lead the country if something happens to the president, and two, to help the president get elected. The 25th Amendment says that if the president dies or is incapacitated, the vice president becomes president. The 25th Amendment also says that there is a way for the vice president to remove a president. If you can get a majority of the cabinet to go along with the vice president, you can in fact remove a president, temporarily at least. Okay, so make sure you know that about the vice presidency. Very much there to help a president get elected, to kind of make up for what the nominee is seen as being weak on. President Bush and Obama were seen as being weak on foreign policy. That's why you had a Vice President Cheney and a Vice President Biden. Okay, now let's move on to the judiciary. Okay, and when we talk about the judiciary, you need to understand that there's not much to it. Article 3 of the Constitution creates the Supreme Court of the United States. The Judiciary Act of 1789 created all the lower courts. You have three different levels. You have one Supreme Court, you have the circuit courts underneath, and then you have the 94 district courts underneath that. Now, how do you get to be a judge on the Supreme Court? You get nominated by the president, you get confirmed by the Senate. All you need is a majority vote. Nowadays, it gets a lot more controversial. The Judiciary Committee holds hearings. Ever since Robert Bork in 1987, they've become increasingly contentious. There's this issue of a litmus test, and a litmus test is where senators say, you know what, you might be capable, you might have good character and good competence, but I don't agree with your I don't agree with you ideologically, so I'm going to say no. That is a litmus test, and that's increasingly what you're seeing. Both parties participating in that kind of a criteria for electing judges. Okay, so president nominates, the Senate confirms. They go through a lot of trials and tribulations. Clarence Thomas had a very, very scandalous hearing. Make sure you know that. Now, a few terms of judicial activism. Judicial activism, you can, both sides, liberals and conservatives, throw it about. Activism has a few definitions. One would be when a judge uses their own personal opinions to make decisions instead of using precedent or the Constitution. Another idea of judicial activism is to overturn previous decisions or to create new precedent. That tends to be, or another term abroad is broad constructionalism, which is where you see rights that are in there that aren't really written down, they're not explicit, they're not enumerated. So activism can mean a few things. Using one's personal opinion, injecting new rights onto the Constitution, grafting what we call penumbras in there, even though they're not really listed. Judicial restraint tends to mean, I'm going to defer to Congress, I'm going to defer to the states, I'm not going to insert the Supreme Court into this political issue. It can also mean that, I might not like a previous court's decision, but I'm going to allow it to go. I'm going to allow it to maintain its permanence. I'm going to exercise stare decisis, which means let the decision stand. So judicial restraint means I'm not going to create new precedent. I'm not going to create a bunch of new rights. I'm not going to overturn previous decisions. So make sure you know activism and restraint, okay? Liberal judges tend to see more rights, tend to believe in rights that aren't necessarily there, but they believe that you can reason your way to it. Conservatives tend to believe more in this idea of an original document, that the Constitution doesn't change its meaning over time, that the only rights we have are the ones that are listed, and if they're not listed, then the states and the Congress have a right to legislate on it. A good example would be gay marriage. Marriage has always been a state issue. It hasn't ever really been a federal issue. Now, it might become a civil rights issue, in which case it would be. But conservatives say, let the states deal with that. It's a state issue. A liberal judge might say, no, hold on, you're dealing with equal protection, you're dealing with the 14th Amendment, that's a civil rights issue. We should rule on that and create a universal standard. So that's a good example of kind of the conservative-liberal schism that you see. Now, how do you get to the Supreme Court? Well, three different ways to get there. You can start the state route. You can have original jurisdiction, where a case begins in the Supreme Court. The most common way is what we call the appellate route, and that's where it begins in the district court. Then it goes to the appellate or the circuit court, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. So there are three different ways of doing it. Now, what happens is everybody petitions the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, to accept it, has to issue something called a writ of certiorari, which means to make more certain. They only issue certiorari for about 1% of all decisions, right? So that's how you actually get to the court, is they have to bring it up from the lower case, they have to issue certiorari, then you have your oral argument, and then the judges talk about it. Now, before they have the oral argument, they want to listen to all sides, so sometimes they'll say to the outside groups, hey, give us a brief. What does the what does the NAACP think about this? What does the NRA think about this? What does the military think about this? These are called amicus curiae briefs. They mean friends of the court. So make sure you know that term. It's on the AP test a lot. They have the oral argument. They make their decision. They write their decision. Sometimes it's an unsigned decision, so you don't know which judge said what. That would mean per curiam is unsigned. But usually you have a decision. It takes 5 people, by the way, to make a decision. That's called a majority opinion. If you are on the other side, that's called a dissenting opinion. Forgot to say something a minute ago. You have the rule of 4. To issue a writ of certiorari, you only need 4 judges. To make a decision, you actually need 5. But to get a case brought up, you only need 4. Make sure you know that, okay? Make sure you also know some of the important judges, Marshall, Taney, Warren, Berger, Rehnquist, John Roberts. Might need to write about those in the free response section, okay? And the Supreme Court is checked in countless ways by the other branches. Obviously, they're nominated by the president. They're confirmed by the Senate. You can amend the Constitution. That's what happened in the 16th Amendment with income taxes. And you can even actually, we never talk about this, but Congress can actually take away a province of the Supreme Court and actually write a law that says, hey, you can't deal with these kinds of cases. They've never done it, but they could if they wanted to, right? So make sure you know all that about the Supreme Court. Now let's move on to the bureaucracy. The Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act was an attempt to professionalize the American bureaucracy. Teddy Roosevelt was the first commissioner of civil service reform. It was going to be getting rid of the Jacksonian spoil system and have a system of merit. You have the Hatch Act, which says that federal workers cannot engage in partisan politics on the job. Make sure you know about the different departments of government. Make sure you know that the Defense Department is a huge institution. Make sure you know the difference between cabinet and all the cabinet departments. What do? They enforce the laws and they run programs. Do not confuse that with government corporations like NASA or the post office, where they kind of act like or Amtrak, where they provide a service, but they're heavily subsidized by the federal government. And then don't confuse that with the third thing, which is all the regulatory agencies. And the regulatory agencies are very important. Make sure you know about the SEC. They regulate the stock market. The EPA, they regulate businesses when it comes to protecting the environment. Make sure you know about the Federal Reserve, who control interest rates in the nation's money supply. Make sure you know about the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They make sure there's no racism or any kind of discrimination in the workplace. The FEC, they regulate American elections. And the FCC, which deals with is the Federal Commission dealing with communications, right? Remember Eminem, the FCC won't let me be. Right, and it's dealing with public airwaves. So make sure you know they regulate some sector of the economy. Thank you, Commerce Clause in Article 1 of the Constitution. Now, how do presidents try and control the bureaucracy? Well, they don't do it very well, but they suggest reorganizing agencies. They tinker with the budget. They make nominations for personnel. They issue executive orders. Congress really has more power trying to control the bureaucracy because they have the power of the purse, they have the power of oversight, they have the power of confirmation, they can create new departments, they can reorganize departments. Congress has a lot more power dealing with agencies, even though nowadays a lot of people would say that the federal government is so big, Congress has very few resources to deal with this Goliath of the federal government, which is why bureaucrats, 2, 3, 4, 5 tiers down, exercise a lot of authority now, because this was a big question on the AP test a few years ago. The bureaucracy gets a lot of their power from the fact that Congress writes very vague laws. Sometimes their oversight is not the best, and oftentimes bureaucrats have a level of expertise that lawmakers don't have, so they leave a lot of that discretion to bureaucrats, people working in the bureaucracy. And the people who work in the bureaucracy, they have a continuity of service. They're there for a lifetime. Congressmen and presidents come and go. So bureaucracies wield a tremendous amount of power for those reasons, right? Make sure you know what an iron triangle is. Iron triangles are not important as they used to be, but iron triangles is where you have a congressional committee, you have a regulatory agency, and you have an interest group, and it's where they each do something for one another, and of course it's very anti-democratic. The people are shut out, but the interest group they give money to congressmen who then fund the bureaucracy that treats that business and interest group the way that they want to be treated. So they kind of each have their own thing. Congressmen get reelected. The bureaucracy gets their funding. The interest group has the regulation or the law that they favor. It's mutually symbiotic. It's all good for them, not good for us. Okay. Now let's move on to civil liberties and civil rights. First Amendment, 4 freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and the freedom to petition the government. Let's start off by talking about the really important court cases dealing with free speech. Make sure you know about Schenck versus U.S., which deals with this doctrine of clear and present danger. That was written in 1919. It said that, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. Make sure you know that. Also, make sure you know about 1989. That would be symbolic speech like burning of the flag. Texas versus Johnson, where the Supreme Court said that symbolic free speech is in fact protected. Make sure you know about libel and slander. Libel is said, spoken is, libel is written, slander is said. New York Times versus Sullivan said it's hard to prove those things. You have to show a malicious intent and a reckless disregard for the truth. Make sure you know about young people and free speech. 1964, Tinker versus Des Moines, the black armbands, where the Supreme Court said, look, you do not shed your constitutional rights at the school door. Okay, make sure you know that. So those are the court cases you need to know on free speech. What about religion? Well, 2 clauses dealing with religion. Remember, on religion, that very famous letter that Jefferson sent to a bunch of Connecticut Baptists, that's not in the Constitution. That idea of a wall separating church and state, that comes from a letter from Thomas Jefferson. But there are 2 clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And the Establishment Clause essentially said that the federal government, we cannot establish a church. We cannot establish, or later on they said, cannot even favor religion over non-religion. So that's the Establishment Clause. Free Exercise Clause says we can't stop people from freely practicing their religion. Important court cases. Engel versus Vitale. Essentially said, look, you cannot have school prayer. New York State tried to do it. You can't have school-led prayer. You can have prayer in schools. Pray all you want, but it can't be led by the school. That's the Establishment Clause case you need to know. Also, Lemon versus Kurtzman. Make sure you know that one as well. When it comes to free exercise, make sure you know Wisconsin versus Yoder, dealing with the Amish. Make sure you also know about Employment Division versus Smith, and that was in Oregon, dealing with using drugs as a part of your religious ritual. And the Supreme Court actually said, you know what, that's not an excuse. They sided with the state law over Smith. So make sure you know those court cases when it comes to the First Amendment and freedom of religion. Now, let's talk about due process. 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th Amendments. I'm going to tell you the amendment and the court case you need to know. 4th Amendment, no unreasonable searches and seizures. No Mapp versus Ohio, that established the exclusionary rule. 5th Amendment, no double jeopardy. You have eminent domain. And finally, no self-incrimination. Miranda versus Arizona is the case you need to know for that. 6th Amendment, you have a right to a speedy trial by your peers. You can have an attorney. Gideon versus Wainwright, which said that the state has to provide an attorney for you if you want one. That's the court case to know there. 8th Amendment, so no cruel and unusual punishment. Know the court case of Gregg versus Georgia, which said that capital punishment is not unconstitutional. And the 9th Amendment, which is unenumerated rights. Make sure you know Griswold versus Connecticut. That's a blockbuster, which said that there is a general right to privacy, and then that was extended in 1973 in Roe v. Wade, which dealt with reproductive rights, abortion, extending the right to privacy. Okay, so make sure you know those court cases and those amendments. Okay, now let's move on to civil liberties. We all know after the Civil War, African Americans were not treated equally. You have Jim Crow laws, which is in the South. All the states wrote laws that essentially, kept them in kind of they weren't slaves, but they really weren't free yet. You have the white primary, you have grandfather clauses, you have literacy tests, you have poll taxes. These are all examples of Jim Crow laws. Obviously, worst case in American history is Dred Scott versus Sanford. And in Dred Scott versus Sanford, you had Roger Taney say that not only were slaves property, but Congress doesn't even have the power to legislate on the issue of slavery. Ergo, the Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional. So that directly led to the the Civil War, at least if you believe Abraham Lincoln. Make sure you know it. Now, let's talk about some of those post-Civil War amendments. 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and then you get to the most important amendment in the Constitution other than the First Amendment, and that's the 14th Amendment. 3 clauses you need to know in the 14th Amendment. The Citizenship Clause, which said that anybody who's born in the United States is a citizen. That's the way that the writers of the 14th Amendment cleverly dealt with former slaves, is by saying, look, if you were born in America, you are an American. Nowadays, that creates huge problems because of immigration and this phenomenon that we call anchor babies, but that's a different issue. Now, what about the equal protection and the due process amendments, right? The due process clause of the 14th Amendment is really important. This is on the AP test every single year. I'm going to say it again. The due process clause of the 14th Amendment is really, really, really important. Why? Because it led to this revolution in constitutional thinking called selective incorporation. Before incorporation, which started in 1925, Gitlow versus New York, before incorporation, it sounds weird, the federal Bill of Rights were ignored by the states. So for instance, if you look at the first sentence of the Constitution, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Well, some people took that to mean that, well, Congress can't do it, but New Hampshire can, or Kentucky can, or Nevada can. And before incorporation, guess what? They could. So what the Supreme Court started doing in 1925 was they would take different rights that are in the Bill of Rights and incorporating them into the states through the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, in the 14th Amendment, it says no state can deprive a citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that makes sense, by the way. In the Fifth Amendment, it also says that. It says no citizen can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. But the Fifth Amendment is referring to the federal government. Well, that makes sense. In 1787, what were we worried about? Well, we were worried about what the federal government was going to do to usurp our rights. But by 1868, we're not worried about the federal government anymore. We're worried about states taking away the newly won rights of former slaves. And so in the 14th Amendment, it says no state can deprive another of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's used to justify what we call selective incorporation, taking this bundle of rights in the Bill of Rights and incorporating them into the states. So now the states have to obey the Bill of Rights. Now the Third Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, they have not been incorporated. The Second Amendment was just incorporated a few years ago in the year 2010. So make sure you know all about selective incorporation. It is always on the AP test, always, always, always. The other part of the 14th Amendment is equal protection. And when we talk about equal protection, it can get a lot more complicated than I have time to talk about right now. Make sure you know about Brown versus the Board of Education, which obviously got rid of, overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, got rid of separate but equal, and made sure that African Americans and whites went to the same school, ended segregation as we know it. Make sure you also know about Bakke versus the California Board of Regents, what dealt with affirmative action. And what Bakke versus the California Board of Regents said was no quotas, but you can have affirmative action. You can consider race as one consideration of many in an application process, and that public schools that do that are not violating the 14th Amendment. Supreme Court just ruled on that again last year, and it was a really confusing decision. I read it. Don't really understand what Anthony Kennedy was saying, even though he is a very, very smart man. So with that in mind, make sure you know those equal protection cases, Brown, Bakke, and also Westbury versus Sanders. Now, civil rights movement, we all know, started with Rosa Parks. 3 big laws you've got to know. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the most important law of the 20th century, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Got to know that one. That made sure that we enforced the 14th Amendment. It got rid of de facto segregation. Now, Brown versus the Board of Education got rid of de jure segregation. That means by law. De facto means in practice, in reality. We were still doing it in the South. They were still bifurcating the populations of whites and blacks. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said, no, once and for all, we're going to enforce the 14th Amendment. We're going to get rid of de facto segregation. No segregation in public accommodations. Hotels, motels, restaurants. No segregation on the basis of race or age or gender or religion. None of that. We're done with that. Also created the EEOC. Make sure you know about the Voting Rights Act, which is where the federal government went down to the South, tried to increase and augment the power of African Americans when it comes to the vote. Very successful. And then make sure you also know the 24th Amendment, which outlawed poll taxes as well. Okay? Also laws to look at, I don't have time to get into them now. Make sure you know the Americans with Disabilities Act, and make sure you know the Higher Education Act of 1972, also known as Title IX. Okay, now let's move on. We're getting close to the end here. Political socialization. The process by which we acquire a political identity. In general, Americans don't trust government like they used to. Levels of trust have declined. We have more intrusive media. We have more scandal. All kinds of reasons for declining trust. But I'm going to go down this really fast and say who's a Republican, who's a Democrat, who's a liberal, who's a conservative, who votes, who doesn't. The most important factor in political socialization is family. Republican parents have Republican babies. Democrat parents have Democrat babies. Males tend to be a little bit more Republican. They tend to be a little more focused on international. You have this concept called the gender gap, which is where women tend to vote more for Democrats. That's where the war on women came from, this idea that women also, by the way, vote more than men. And so women tend to be more democratic. They tend to vote more than men. If you can keep them on the Democratic side, it fares well for the Democratic Party into the future. So make sure you know the gender gap. Jews tend to be a huge block of the Democratic Party. Catholics tend to be relatively even. They tend to vote for the winner in presidential elections. Protestants kind of break slightly for Republicans, and evangelicals are the base of the Republican Party, overwhelmingly Republican, a very devout group of Republicans. Make sure you also know that when it comes to education, that is the best predictor for if you will vote. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote. Most people who only have a high school degree vote for Democrats. People with a college degree tend to be a little more Republican. If you have a PhD, it depends on where you work. If you are teaching gender studies at Harvard, probably going to vote for the Democrat. If you are a chemical engineer for Exxon, probably going to be a Republican. So depends what you do when it comes to the PhD. Now, African Americans, overwhelmingly Democrats. They are the base of the Democratic Party, most loyal voting bloc. Whites tend to be more Republican. Latinos, by a 2-to-1 split, are Democrats. Actually, it was more than that in the last election. Asians are also increasingly Democratic. This is why Republicans are going to have to do better if they want to win another presidential race. Republicans tend to be more rural, more kind of inland. Urban voters tend to be more kind of affected by the Democratic agenda. So urban voters tend to be more Democrat. You have the solid South, which tends to be more Republican in its voting patterns. New England, the West Coast, also called the Left Coast, where I'm from, tends to be very Democrat in their voting. So, you know, Washington, Oregon, California, it's going to be solid Democrat. Same with New England, but the South tends to be very, very Republican. That's why it's called the solid South. Young people tend to be devout Democrats. When you get a little older, you're paying taxes, you're having babies, you're having a family, you tend to be a little bit more Republican. Then when you get much older, it tends to be split because you're getting those nice government entitlements, but you're also a little more culturally conservative. So the older vote tends to be a little bit more split as well. Make sure you know that wealthy people tend to vote more Republican, even though you do have this phenomenon called limousine liberals. Really, really wealthy people, you know, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Steven Spielberg, they tend to be liberals, but in general, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. Married people tend to be Republican. Gun owners tend to be Republican. Union members tend to be Democrats. Homosexuals tend to be Democrats. And so there you go. 26th Amendment gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. And make sure you guys know the 1993 Motor Voter Act. And make sure you know as well the differences in how states sign people up to vote. States still have a tremendous power when it comes to regulating elections. And that's why the harder it is to sign up to vote, the less there is in voter turnout. And that's why the South has these arduous voter procedures and they have very low turnout. Okay, now moving on to the last topic here. And that would be political parties, interest groups, and elections. Make sure you guys know what a linkage institution is. A linkage institution links the voter to the political process, but it can't be part of government itself. So like the media, a political party, an interest group, these are all linkage institutions. Let's start with political parties. They are there to win elections. They recruit candidates. They run campaigns. They try and get control of the public policy apparatus to implement their agenda. They're there to inform the public. Those are all the functions of political parties. And we have a two-party system, always have. In the very beginning, you had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Then you had the Democrats and the Whigs. Today you have Republicans and Democrats. And we need to talk about this issue called critical elections and realignment. A realignment is when you have new voting blocks coming together for the very first time and creating a new party. That happens during a critical election. So you have critical elections in 1800, where the Democratic Republicans were born. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson. 1828, where Jacksonian Democrats were born. 1860, where Lincoln Republicans were born. 1932, where you have FDR Democrats, right? That's realignment. We have new voting blocks coming together and they stick together for a long time. That's called a realignment. Only happens during critical elections. What you have nowadays is what we call de-alignment. And de-alignment is synonymous with third parties, where you have a voting block, but then it breaks away for an election cycle. So in 1992, you had the Reform Party, they cared about budgets, tended to be Republicans, they broke off. In 2000, you had the Green Party, they were environmentalists, they tended to vote Democrat, they broke off. Remains to be seen in 2016. Is the Tea Party going to be a third party, or are they just going to be a part of the Republican Party that's disillusioned with its nominee, perhaps, if it's Jeb Bush or somebody like that? So, or Chris Christie, whoever. So that's what de-alignment is. The knock is that they cost elections, and I think that's totally fair. If you didn't have Ross Perot, you probably don't have a Bill Clinton. If you didn't have Ralph Nader in 2000, you probably don't have a George W. Bush presidency. They are spoilers, but they are important. They are great. I mean, they tend to get their way. That's what happens to third parties. They go away. Why? Because they get their way. That's a good thing about third parties. So make sure you know those terms. When you talk about third parties, lots of historic ones, the abolitionists, you had the free soilers, you had the know-nothings. Probably the most successful one in history is the Progressive Party, or the Populist Party. William Jennings Bryan twice got nominated. The Democrats didn't even have a nominee, they just took him. So make sure you know those third parties, okay? Now, parties, why are they not as powerful as they used to be? Because candidates don't need them like they used to. Nowadays, candidates have their own way of raising money. They have their own way of nominating or getting the nomination. They have their own way of communicating. You know, it used to be that at conventions every 4 years, the party bosses, is what we call smoke-filled rooms filled with, you know, cigars and brandy, and you had all the party bosses, and they'd come in and they'd pick the nominee. That's not the way of it anymore. So parties are not as powerful as they used to be. The progressive era really gutted the power of parties in that way, right? And make sure you know there is no one party. You have the DNC and the RNC, but those are the national parties. You have 50 state parties. You have thousands of local parties. So make sure you understand that. Now, let's talk about the election process, specifically the presidential election process. Part one, step one, is what we call the invisible primary. That's where we are right now, by the way. This is April of 2014. Right now, you have people kind of feeling out. Oh, am I going to run? Am I not? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. That's the invisible primary. You're there to kind of see if people are interested in you, see if you can raise any money. That's an important thing. You actually start voting in the primary process. And the primary process is where each state has its own election, and members of the party gather and decide who they want their nominee to be. And the earlier your primary or caucus is, the more important it is. That's called front loading, right? And that's really, really important. I don't know what happened there, sorry. When you front load, what you do is you put your caucus or your primary earlier so that the media will pay all the attention. So Iowa and New Hampshire get all the attention. Why? Because they're the first two, okay? And so make sure you know about Iowa and New Hampshire. They get all of the love there. Now, how do you actually get the nomination? Well, you got to look at the different kinds of primaries. You have a caucus, which is more of a party meeting where you meet at a certain time in a certain place and you take a vote. Whereas a primary is like a normal election. You show up, you cast your vote, and whoever gets the most votes wins the primary. Now, this can be kind of confusing. This is on the AP test sometimes, so pay attention. Democrats in 2008 had it so that it was proportional, so that if you got 51% of the vote in a state, you got 51% of the delegates in the primary. That's why the Obama-Clinton competition went on and on and on, because you could lose the primary but get almost as many delegates as the person who won it because it was proportional. John McCain in 2008 got the nomination really fast. Why? Because Republicans had a winner-take-all system, right? So you have all the 50 states, they have their primaries. How do you get the actual nomination? You have to get a majority of the delegates. Where do they actually count the delegates? Well, they do that at the convention, but not before you have all the primaries. Remember, you have the closed primary, where only the party membership can vote. You have an open primary where they allow independents, or you can even have the other party come in and vote if they want to, right? And you don't even have a blanket primary anymore. That was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But once they're all done, they meet in the summer, all the delegates get together and all the states vote, and whoever gets a majority wins the nomination, right? It used to be exciting, but nowadays we have the primary process. It's a foregone conclusion. I'll talk about the superdelegates here in just a minute, so make sure you guys know that. Make sure you know about how these elections work. The FEC regulates the elections. You have to say how much money they have to report. All the campaigns have to say how much they've donated or how much money they've been given to the FEC. The Federal Election Campaign Act in the 1970s was the one that created limitations. When you talk about hard money, that's money that goes directly to the candidate. That's limited today to $2,300 per candidate per person. So my wife could give $2,300 to Hillary Clinton. I could give $2,300 to Chris Christie. You can actually do that twice, by the way. You can do it in the primary and in the general election. Soft money is money that goes to the parties. That's for fundraising purposes. McCain-Feingold in 2003 doubled hard money but got rid of soft money. That's because of all the corruption in the Clinton years dealing with soft money. Matching funds. Matching funds is money that is given to presidential candidates who are running for office. Matching funds only exist for presidential elections. So if you take public money, if you're running for president and you say, hey, I want the federal government to give me money for my campaign, you have to agree to limit your expenditures. That's the deal with taking what we call publicly financed campaigns. Now, Barack Obama didn't take matching funds. Why? Because he didn't want to limit his ability to spend. Don't blame him, right? And so matching funds are only for presidential races. Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976, that dealt with campaign finance as well. Essentially, if, you cannot tell an individual spending on their own race that they can't spend. So Mitt Romney could spend as much as he wanted to, Ross Perot could spend as much as he wanted to, John Corzine could spend as much as he wanted to. Okay? Make sure you know your theories of power: elite, pluralist, hyper-pluralist. Now, let's talk about interest groups. Interest groups are very different than political parties. Political parties are there to win elections and to get people into office, right? Interest groups are very narrow. They have one issue. They support candidates, but they don't run candidates, right? That's a big difference between the two. So make sure you know that. Political action committees, what do? Very simple. They raise money, they spend money. The most they can spend is $5,000. They have to give to at least 5 different candidates, and they are much more important for congressional races than presidential races because they can give to hundreds of different races if they want to, right? So make sure you know that. Now, interest groups, how do they affect the public policy agenda? Well, they lobby in lots of different ways. Sometimes they will have meetings with elected officials. Sometimes they have rallies. Sometimes they have protests. Sometimes they have sit-ins. Sometimes they use litigation. The NAACP uses litigation. They sue people. Sometimes they have grassroots, which means local, where they try and get local organizations, maybe a campus or a college, to have events. That's grassroots. Sometimes they just give money. That's the most common form, probably, is campaign donations. These are all ways that interest groups try and affect the public policy apparatus. And make sure you know, by the way, about the famous ones. AARP is probably the most powerful one in America that deals with the elderly. The NRA deals with the Second Amendment. The Sierra Club deals with the environment. NARAL deals with abortion rights. GLAAD deals with the rights of homosexuals. The NAACP deals with African Americans. So make sure you know all of those interest groups and what they do. Yeah, litigation, campaign donations, protests, sit-outs, you name it, okay? Finally, make sure you know about the budget. Make sure you know what an entitlement is. In the federal budget, you have mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is money that the federal government can control every year. Defense is the biggest part of discretionary spending. Mandatory is Social Security and Medicare, and that's where if you qualify, the federal government has to give it to you, and that's an increasing part of our budget, which is why we're having so many problems with our budgets, because we can't control it because it's mandatory, right? So make sure you know the 3 biggest parts of our budget: Social Security, Medicare, and the military. Only one of them is discretionary spending. Who writes the budget? The president does with the OMB, but then he gives it off to Congress and they completely rewrite it. But make sure you know the OMB. They give the first draft and they hand it off to Congress, and then Congress has the power of the purse. Make sure you guys know about the welfare reform bill in the 1990s. This gave a lot more power to the states to have their own welfare systems, where they created work requirements. It was a good example of kind of decentralization, giving that power back to the states. Make sure you know about DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, written in 1996. This is the law that said that states do not have to honor the marriage agreements of other states. That was written in 1996, I believe. It was actually just declared unconstitutional last year, but it deals with Article 4, full faith and credit. So make sure you know that. Okay, and then finally, here are some things that have been on the test the last few years that I didn't mention. Make sure you know what a discharge petition is. Normally in the House of Representatives, a bill goes into a standing committee. That's a permanent committee. That's where all the work is done. I don't know if I mentioned that before. You can actually bypass that. If you can get 218 people to sign on to your petition, they discharge it from the standing committee and it goes up for a vote. I believe that's what they used in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Free rider. A free rider would be a citizen who doesn't pay into a system or to a program, but they still get the benefit. They're free riding. A progressive tax. A progressive tax that means that the more money you make, not only do you pay more taxes, but the higher percentage of your income goes to taxes. Make sure you know what a superdelegate is. A superdelegate is somebody who does not come from one of the states. Democrats have superdelegates, and that's where if you are an important member of the party, if you're a senator, a House member, a former president, if you are somebody in a position of power, you get a vote at the Constitutional Convention. It's getting towards the end here. At the political party convention, you get a vote, even if you're not from the states. You are a superdelegate. Make sure you know that. Political efficacy. That describes the extent to which politics and the political system is working for you. Congressional casework. That's the amount of work that congressmen have. Congressional casework is, congressmen do three things really. They write laws, they conduct oversight, and they do things for you. That's their casework. If you have a problem, if your mother is lost in a Bolivian neighborhood somewhere and you can't find her, you need the State Department to help you out, you contact your congressman. That's their casework, doing personal favors for you, writing a letter so that you can get into the Naval Academy. That's casework. Citizens United, that's been on the AP test here before as well. Citizens United, which said that corporations can spend freely, deals with campaign finance. A lot of people freaked out about that. President Obama went after the Supreme Court right in front of him. Remember Alito saying, no, not true, not true. So it deals with limiting corporations and their ability to spend. Make sure you know the different models as well of leadership. In the Congress, you have the trustee model, and in the trustee model, that means it's kind of Burke, Edmund Burke, who said, you know what, you elected me for my judgment, for my industry. We trust you to do what's right, versus the delegate model of leadership, which is where I elected you to go do what's in my interest. I don't care about what you think, Congressman. You are there in place of me. You do what I want. You are my delegate. So make sure you know that. Okay? Okay, what is this? An hour and 15 minutes. Will be 75 minutes exactly. Good luck, everyone.